Good morning, everyone. Hello, welcome to our webinar for
Good
today.
morning.
So, on behalf of Analyst Data Services and Resources Limited, I want to say thank you to each and every one of you for being here with us today. We are very pleased to be able to welcome those of you that have been with us in our past webinar series, as well as those who are joining us for the very first time. I also want to thank our speaker and also the discussants that we'll be having today, and of course, men of the press for making this a priority. We are grateful to have you join us at ADSR today, and we look forward to meet to more interesting times together. So I will leave us with the ground rules for today's webinar. Let's note that all microphones should be muted except the microphone of the speaker or speakers at the time that they will be speaking. Only the speakers are allowed to have their cameras on during the webinar. Also note that interruptions are not allowed during the presentations. All questions during the presentation should be dropped in the chat box. They will be treated after the discussions. So participants will also be allowed to ask questions during the question and answer session. That will come up immediately after the discussion. So we ensure that when you're asking your questions, you raise your hand. You can use the hand raising icon. And also note that when you consistently violate those rules by not muting, then we can remove you from the meeting. Please note that we'll also be streaming on our YouTube, so you can check our YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/adsrng. We'll be streaming live on YouTube too. Once again, I welcome you. Today we'll be unveiling our report on the Socio-Economic Scorecard of Nigerian states, and that will be presented by the Chief Economist at ADSR, Dr. Folabi Olorukire, after which there will be a discussion on the policy implications. Joining us today will be Professor Bright Area, Dr. Sheyi Vicent, and also Mr. Dr. Sheyingo. If you have any questions, suggestions, or clarifications, please drop them in the chat box. They will be attended to by the admin. Like I said, we'll be streaming, so the link will be dropped in the chat box so you can share with others. Thank you very much for listening. Once again, I welcome you all. Thank you. Then the speaker will join us soon. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. I hope we had a great day so far. Thank you once again for joining us. We're very glad. So today, we'll be unveiling our report that we have called Socio-Economic Scorecard of Nigerian states. It's a 2023 baseline edition. For many of us that have been following some of the releases in recent times, we just did one for the entire country, which we call Nigeria in figure, the socio-economic data book, which looks at socio-economic development in the country from 1998. Today, we'll be looking at the state component of that. We've actually been able to analyze many of the data with that report and make them available to us if we want to start sharing. So once again, welcome to this meeting. Contents of the report. After the introduction, I will speak briefly about the methodology that we use. The indicators by segment, we actually have about 12 segments that we are looking at in every state of the country. Then we look at our data sources. There's performance segment by segment, then performance state by state. We have an appendices. As a way of introduction, as we all know, after the election this year, many of the state governors have already constituted their cabinet, and many of them are already putting together their state economic development as well as several strategy documents. And the usual promise always is that things will be better now than before. But how do you know whether things are better if they are not objectively measured in a dispassionate manner, not only by the state that are concerned, but by independent institutions who may also be tracking whatever is happening across states. And very importantly is also the ability to compare several states so that states can see development across other states or across regions with which they can learn. It doesn't even mean that one is trying to say one state perform better than the other, as we later see. There are states that are strong in one thing, even the strongest of the states will also have an area where it has to perform. Most times, it's not that data are not available, but in the manner in which they are available are probably not easy to understand. They may not be easily usable or readily usable or comparable. And this is the gap that this particular work is trying to fill. Specifically, we consider recent data and most recent and available socioeconomic data on the Nigerian statistics state and FCT. We analyzed them, we aggregated them into a performance scorecard so that we can show the relative ranking of states. And what is the aim? We want to provide baseline data and highlight the performance of the performance of so that we can aid policy making at the subnational level, at the level of subnational government. In terms of methodology, we actually have a total of 57 relevant indicators that we have used in computing our scorecard. And as I've said, these are across 12 broad socioeconomic segments, such as economic output performance, government finance, financial sector, capital importation, land, housing and sanitation, transportation, ICT infrastructure, energy and environment, industrialization and business competitiveness, education, health, and citizen livelihood and welfare. In the small equation that is on the screen, without necessarily bothering us about how that is derived, it just shows how we are able to bring these indicators together into different segments so that we can have something that is relatively robust and proven. That continues to how we are able to derive our ultimate overall index in equation 2. And then we also perform a particular thing because the states are not isolated from the general trend of this indicator at the national level. We then find a way of computing an equally weighted average of the nation and that of the state so that we can have something that reflects what happens at the national. Because what we have to avoid, every state operates within Nigeria. So, okay, so this shows us the list of indicators that we are using by the segment. As I mentioned, there are 12 segments. And when it comes to the economic output performance, we actually did some estimates of GDP for the state, as well as the growth rate of their real GDP. But that also implies that you have to calculate the GDP deflator for the state. For government finance, we look at total revenue by state, expenditure by state, IGR, distribution of VAT, domestic debt, external debt by state. In financial sector, we also have a list of variables, as you can see on my screen, that are used in computing the indicator for that particular segment. Capital importation, we look at how much these states were able to attract in terms of foreign capital inflow into their respective states. Land, housing, and sanitation, we look at possession of title documents on agricultural land, on non-agricultural land, on dwellings, type of dwelling, source of drinking water, type of storage facility. Transportation, we also consider involved in the area of air transportation because data is actually readily more available and comparable on that particular segment. We also have ICT infrastructure, energy and environment, industrialization, and business competitiveness, education, health, as well as citizen livelihood and welfare. So just okay, sorry, apology was just to look at some things. In terms of the sources of our data, all data used in this work are obtained from the 2023 edition of Nigerian in Figures, a socio-economic data book. To see more details about that data book, the link on the system can also be followed. We can have access to some of the data in the data book, the ones that are freely available, as well as the ones that are subscription-based. But all data are from the 2023 edition of Nigerian Figures, a socio-economic data book. So this is the segment performance. In terms of each of the 12 segments. So the first segment is economic output. As I said, I'll be taking us through the 12 segments, economic output. The average score on that segment is 45.79. That is about 45.79%. As I've shown the methodology is able to tell us whether a state will rank between 0, actually between 1 and 100. So the average score for all states in the country is 45.79. And the best performing states are Lagos at 62.5, FCT at 58.9, and Oyo at 58.0. While the least performing states are Yobe at 34.5, Gombe at 45, and Sokoto at 36.8. As you can see on the charts on the right-hand side, the average is the one that is colored in orange. Then we can see states that fall below the average, as well as the states that fall above the average. So the same thing is done for each of the indicators. For instance, when it comes to state finance, the average score there is 47%. And the best performing states are Delta at 65, Akwa Ibom at 64.8, and Rivers at 64.4. As you can see, these are states that are oil producing, while the least performing states are Ebonyi, Ekiti, and Nasarawa. As I said, we can also see states that they perform relative to one another in the charts on the right-hand side. When it comes to capital importation, the financial sector, the average score is 51.96. It's actually one of the segments where we have average score that is above 50%. And the best performing states are Ogun, Kaduna, and Oyo, while the least performing states are Bayelsa, Yobe, and Bauchi. Capital importation, average score 41.17%. The best performing state, Lagos at 68.7, FCT at 67.8, Ogun at 61.1%. While the least performing states are Bayelsa, Ebonyi, and Gombe. Land, housing, and sanitation. The average score is 44.43. The best performing states are Kano at 57.9, Adamawa at 57.5, Katsina at 3.9, while the least performing states are Ebonyi, Benue, and Bayelsa. On transportation, especially looking at the air aspect of transportation, the average score is 34.24%. That is relatively low. But the best performing states are Lagos, FCT, and Rivers, while the least performing states are Abia, Anambra, and Bayelsa. Actually, for states that may not have airports, their scores here will be very low. ICT infrastructure, average score for ICT infrastructure is 58.31%. It's actually, along with the financial sector, one of the segments that is that has high score. The best performing states are Lagos at 81.7, Edo at 75, Oyo at 73.6. While the least performing states are Bayelsa, Gombe, and Zamfara. Energy and environment, average score 44.48%. Best performing states are FCT at 61%, Lagos at 59.3%, Ekiti at 56.1%. While the least performing states are Jigawa, Taraba, and Gambiya. Industrialization and business competitiveness. Average score 48.1%. This is something that is very important to the country. Industrialization, we are still relatively less than an average. The best performing states are Lagos at 70.1, Oyo 62.9, Ogun 61.5. While the least performing are Nasarawa, Zamfara, and Bayelsa. Education, average score 46.95%. The best performing states, Lagos, Ekiti, and FCT, while the least performing states are Yobe, Jigawa, and Sokoto. Health, 48.28%. The best performing states, Katsina at 60.4, Borno at 59.1, FCT at 58.6, while the least performing states are Bauchi, Niger, and Ogun. Citizens' wealth, livelihood, and welfare. This actually measures a lot of things in terms of employment, the kind of job that people do, whether they engage in employment, formal and informal sector, and the rest. The average score, and also measure the poverty level as well as employment. The average score is quite low in terms of citizen livelihood and welfare, and it is 37.14%. However, best performing states are Lagos 9.4, Delta 7.4, Oyo 3.8, while the least performing states are Jigawa, Sokoto, and Yobe. So when we look at all these put together, the average score on all overall average is 45.65%, and that shows the distribution. So when we look at all the 12 segments and bring them together, we can see that generally Lagos is the highest at 62.4%, followed by FCT at 58.6%, Oyo at 54.6%, Rivers at 54%, Kano at 52.7%, and Ogun at 52.5%. While the least states generally are Yobe, Taraba, Zamfara, Ebonyi, Jigawa, and Bayelsa. This just shows us the average overall score to see in which of the segments have these states performed best or least. As I've mentioned earlier, the overall average is 45.65%, which is still slightly below average. So if you take 50% to be the average, 45.65% is slightly lower than the average. Generally, across all states, the best performing segments are ICT on the average 58.31 and financial sector 51.96%, while other sectors score relatively below 50%. The least performing are transportation, especially air transportation, citizen livelihood, and welfare, which is at 37.14%. And I'm sure when discussants speak, they will draw a lot of implications for this. So that is the result by segment. In the report, we also have state by state performance pages. So when we have access to the report, we can then see what happens in each of the states. For instance, I show on my screen, we can see a state like Abia. Abia ranked 18th generally out of 37. It's 36 states plus FCT. The average score of Abia is 45.53%, and you can see we can juxtapose that against the average score of everybody. The strength of Abia, that is segment where it's called the highest out of all the segments, is capital importation, and it is speed. And the worst or the least is transportation here, where Abia is 32nd. This radar also shows how Abia performed in each of the 12 segments. Anytime the blue line is outside the gray line, it means that it has performed better than the average. Anytime it's inside the gray line, it means that it performed lower than the average. And the interpretation is always there. So if you look at it, the same thing that is done for Abia is done for Adamawa, Akwa Ibom, Anambra, Bauchi. For each of the states of the country, we have pages for them that we can have access to when we start looking at this book. So it goes on Lagos, Nasarawa, Ogun, Osun, Oyo, Plateau. For instance, we can take Lagos as an example. Lagos will show that Lagos is first out of 37. The average score of Lagos is 62.38. The strongest point is ICT infrastructure is first there, but the weakest point is health, is number 28 there. So it's just able to lead about 9 other states. Then we can see how its blue line lies outside the green line for some of the sectors where it is performing better than the average of the state. So this will give us opportunity to see how our state perform in relative terms without necessarily showing whether the state is better than another, but just to tell us that states have strength in some things, other states have weakness in other things. But I think to us, it's more of the peer learning and the lesson that one state can gather from the other state. So this goes on to serve as just a data source, just to also tell us that data that are used are from the Nigerian our data book, and also to tell us that for some of us that we also still want to go to see our copies of it. Thank you very much. That's
Thank you very much, Doc, for that insightful presentation. And right now, we're moving on to the next item on the agenda, and that is a discussion of policy implications. And we have our discussants here, and they'll be speaking to us for 5 minutes each. Prof. Area, what are the policy implications of these scorecards, and how do you think subnationals can improve on them, sir?
Okay, good morning. Good morning, Dr. Falabolo for invite. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, so it's very insightful presentation and a guide to, in fact, a baseline for subnational governments as a country if we are looking ahead. So one beautiful thing about this presentation is that just in the past, you see subnational governments coming on board, and then new government will come on board, but they have almost nothing to work with. But for this provides some kind of baseline for them to see how they can track their policy implementation and then be able to track the movement over time. So just straight to, for me to just raise some of the implications. You know, from your presentation, there are about 12 pillars. And by rating, I discovered, which you have also alluded to, is that only 2 of them are above average, right, at the subnational level. And what are these 2? The first among them is ICT infrastructure, and then the other one is financial sector. I see that there is correlation between these 2, in the sense that financial sector should be one of the major users of ICT infrastructure in Nigeria, right, and at the subnational levels in different states. So what this tells me is that these 2 have some level of correlation, and beyond that, also it's also showing us or pointing to the fact that these among, if I let's say if I take out economic performance and then that of livelihood and welfare, which are almost like outcome, right, I can categorize these 2 that are the leading, that perform above 50% as more, driven more by the private sector, right? While the other ones, if you look at them, the involvement is more from the state government or from government than private sector. So that implies that sectors or pillars driven more by the private sector, are the ones that are performing above average. While those that we have more of government involvement or expect more government involvement, are the case of subnational state or subnational government or even at the national level, we have them mostly performing below average, which speaks to one thing. What is it speaking about? It's speaking to the fact that government need to be very efficient in what we do compared to what we get from the private sector. In some parts of the world, like the United Arab Emirates, government leads in terms of providing the vision and efficiency that the private sector should follow. But for us as Nigeria, what you see is that it's the private sector that is now providing that instead of government. And until we change that, I don't think that we could move forward. So that is one of the things I could see in this report. The second thing I see in this report is that I look at states that perform very poorly in terms of the least performing state when it comes to livelihood and welfare. They are Jigawa, Sokoto, and Yobe. Fortunately or unfortunately, in education, the least performing are still these three. And that speaks to one thing. It means that there is correlation between education and livelihood and that of welfare. Because the same three states are the least performing in welfare and livelihood. The same three countries, states are the ones that are the least performing in terms of education. So that speaks to the fact that education is so critical. Education plays a serious role, and so at the subnational level, we need to put more emphasis or drive programs that will help to make education, as critical as possible, knowing fully well that we all know very well that one of the ways we can, in fact, education is so critical in terms of human capital development and all that we could think of. Even in strengthening institutions, you need human capital. So I think that is one thing that came out from this report. The other thing that came out from the report of this report, beyond the link between education and livelihood and the importance of education, is that there are, if you look at industrialization and business competitiveness, right? There are about the leading states in subnational states in this pillar are Lagos, Oyo, and Ogun. Fortunately or unfortunately, about two of these are still rated as the leading when it comes to economic performance. Lagos, and Oyo, except for FCT, there is an outlier because of the city, of the headquarters. So that also points to the fact that when you perform very well in terms of business competitiveness to drive industrialization, then you expect economic performance to be on the increase. At that point, to the fact that subnational government needs to do some things around business competitiveness that could drive industrialization for economic performance. And I think that is also one thing that I saw as a link that is so closely related. Tied to that is also of capital importation. Capital importation, about two southwest states are there, and these two southwest states are Lagos and Ogun, right? The other one is FCT, which I also see as an outlier. So Lagos and Ogun are still part of the three states that are driving industrialization, vis-a-vis to Lagos being one of them for economic performance. And that is also one thing that comes out very strongly in terms of the correlation between these pillars and what we should look at for, right? And then even for the ICT infrastructure that we'll talk about in terms of being driven from the private sector, two southwestern states are there, Lagos and Oyo, which are also part of the states that you could see as industrialization and business, doing very well in terms of industrialization and business competitiveness. So there is serious link between industrialization and business competitiveness with economic performance, and also linked to that or tied to that is capital importation. And then ICT infrastructure. These are critical things. And then in terms of livelihood and welfare, education is critical. So education becomes the motherboard for all of them. And so for nations or states that are not doing well, I think education could be one area we should look into. And therefore, generally, I could say that in terms of what government should do or subnational government should do is efficiency of their spending in terms of ensuring that sectors or pillars where we have more of government involvement could be improved and go beyond the 50% threshold like we have in ICT infrastructure and financial sector that are more from the private sector. That's what I can say for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir. I think the key recommendations you mentioned, government efficiency in spending and importance of education. Thank you very much, sir, for that. I'll come to you now, Dr. Shea. What segments of this scorecard do you think that subnational governments should pay attention to and how they can improve on them?
Yes, good morning. Good morning, Dr. Lopez. Good morning, everyone. Okay, so with regards to subnational governments and some of the steps that they can take, I would like to focus on health sector. So obviously, we all know that health is absolutely important to productivity and growth. Even at a macroeconomic level, it's something that macroeconomists have focused on as an important determinant of economic performance. So it's definitely something that needs to be a strong performance in the health sector and in terms of also providing healthcare to people. So I'm sure we all know as well, like it's one of the universal health coverage is one of the goals of the sustainable development goals. So trying to achieve universal health coverage. So that's definitely something that requires a lot of attention, not just in terms of welfare, but also in terms of economic performance. So Nigeria has implemented quite a few policies, and even even the legislation as well is also supportive of universal health coverage because the country is realizing the importance of health. But however, there have been some challenges that have been faced. So with regards to implementation, it's probably one of the main challenges that we face. So we have, for example, the National Health Insurance Scheme. So that scheme, which focuses on those federal workers, that was implemented in 2005. And then we also have the Basic Healthcare Provision Fund, which was established under the National Health Act. So those are two of the legislations / policies which are supportive of healthcare and universal health coverage. So that's just that as the background. So we know that healthcare is absolutely important, and we have some schemes that have been put together by the government to try to ensure that all Nigerians have access to basic health care. Now, moving on to some national performance. So based on Dr. Oluwakere's presentation, we see that I think he highlighted Katsina, Borno, and FCT are some of the best performing states. So usually when we see statistics on health in Nigeria, it's usually the place where we see certain parts of the country generally performing worse than other parts of the country. So it's quite interesting that we have this, it's not really like focused, but it's spread across the country. So for example, we see one of the Southwest states as being one of the least performing states. So it's definitely something that what I'm trying to say is that it needs to be focused on, across states of Nigeria. So where there are challenges that are being faced, those need to be plugged to ensure that there is wide coverage in terms of healthcare across the population. So one of the things I would just like to highlight is, for example, the FCT has its own health insurance scheme. So that's one of the things that's supportive of access to good healthcare in the FCT. So obviously, when there is health insurance and when that's available to people, and when they have knowledge of health insurance schemes that are in the state, that obviously helps with people accessing healthcare. But Borno and Katsina, for example, they also states with one of the highest basic healthcare provision coverage. So that means that these states, they have a basic minimum package of healthcare which they have access to, which is also supportive of using healthcare facilities and patronizing the formal healthcare sector. So those are some of the things that I think are supportive of the performance of these states in regards to proper um, use of formalized healthcare within the state. So now, in terms of states that are not doing too well, so one of the things I've noticed is that the doctor to patient ratio can be a determining factor. So for a couple of the states, what we see is that they have a very low doctor to patient ratio. So Bauchi, for example, it has a very high coverage in terms of allocation of the national health insurance scheme. However, the doctor to patient ratio is quite low. So for certain states, the problem might be more the effectiveness of spending as opposed to the amount of spending that goes to states. So we know generally allocation of funding for healthcare in Nigeria is quite low. So it's less than 6%, and the general recommendation is 15% based on the Abuja Declaration. But there are also issues with regards to the effectiveness of spending as well. So that can also be contributing to the issues that I've seen. So it might not just be the amount of money that's going towards healthcare, but also how the money is being spent, ensuring that it's spent on the services that the population needs. So that requires having data that can support our policy. So making sure that there are health information systems that are collecting the right information, and they're also being used to provide care for the population. So the effectiveness of spending is one thing I'd like to focus on. And the other thing, like I mentioned, is the doctor to patient ratio, having the right quality and amount of trained professionals to support providing the right kind of care for the people in the states across the country, but obviously particularly with those that are not performing too well. Okay, so data also shows that sometimes patients have problems accessing care. So for two of the states that have the least performing states, particularly Bauchi and Niger, data from the DHS shows that they have challenges with accessing healthcare, due to a number of reasons. So it could be lack of funds to seek care, distance to the healthcare centers. So again, need to be looking at the availability of health insurance, and also making sure that there's the availability of healthcare centers within reach for people to access. So we want to make sure that people are sensitized with regards to health insurance, what's available, and make sure that health insurance is also affordable. Okay, so I just want to summarize. So three things I would like to point out. So the availability of trained health professionals. So states that have low doctor to patient ratios, that is something that needs to be addressed. Health insurance coverage, ensuring that people are aware about health insurance, making sure health insurance is affordable. So we all know about the recent NHIA Act, which makes health insurance mandatory, but doesn't necessarily mean that people will be aware about health insurance. So sensitization and encouraging people to take up health insurance is very important. And also making sure that the right services are available and people are aware, and the information is collected to ensure that it's being channeled towards providing the right healthcare for people in the states. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ma. Thank you so much for your recommendations. Mr. Dr. Shengo, I would come to you now, sir. As Dr. Shea has emphasized on the health sector, what other sectors or segments do you think that subnationals should pay attention to, and recommendations from you, sir?
Thank you so much, Dorcas, and good morning, everyone, and thanks for being here. Also to appreciate the ADSR team for this important knowledge project. For this important knowledge product and this insight into what's happening in our subnational economies. I think this is something that's really novel. And also to point out that what I see from this report also is not really so much about who is leading or who is lagging. Yeah, that's interesting to note, but I think one important interesting thing about this report also is that it's helping to states generally learning from data that is available out there about how they're doing. And I think that point is very important to make that point. So we do not get here to say, we would see that across board, as Professor Ereha mentioned the other time and Dr. Vincent spoke, the performance across all the indicators is not that great. We see on indicators where states on average are having 30-something%. And I think that's abysmal. And it only shows that there's a lot of room for states a lot of room for them to sort of improve. A few points that I'd like to draw from the report, and I think Professor Arella and Dr. Vincent kind of hinted on this, is that we were looking at some of the leading subnationals, particularly singling out Lagos and FCT, and when you also look at Oyo State and a few others. One thing you would get is that there seemed to be more of a pattern that is policy neutral here. Policy neutral, and what I mean by policy neutral is you do not see results that are probably influenced by deliberate policy choices, but are sort of influenced by more of what I would call maybe endowment effect, headquarter effect. Professor Arella mentioned, like, for example, for Lagos, it's a commercial, capital of the country. Abuja is political capital of the country. When you check some of these subnationals, they're merely benefiting from what I would call, like I said, not necessarily because they're making good policies, right? Not necessarily because they can say, oh, this is what we're doing to make this. Is pretty much because Abuja, you have businesses there because it's the headquarters. Lagos State, the heritage effect, the proximity to markets and all of those things, and some of the infrastructure, legacy infrastructure that the state has inherited. And I think it's important to make that point. We haven't seen states that maybe in the last 3 decades or 4 decades have been lagging, and we're seeing some major jump in their performance. So I think that point it's important to make that point. So I'd say leading subnationals, going by this report, are merely benefiting from inherited or endowment advantages and not so much of policy stimulated advantages. We need to move from being a child that maybe is born in a rich family, in quote, that's then not able to transform those inherited advantages or endowment advantages to real real advantages and real growth. And then one thing that's also evident in the report we would see is the north-south divide on most subnational economic indices, as we see from the result. And this is further buttressed by also the social development indices, particularly poverty that Professor Rea did mention about education. Education, for example, you see the northern states lagging. So there has to be some, intentional, some deliberate attempts to ensure that this north-south divide is actually bridged. I would like to also touch a bit on industrial competitiveness generally and business environment for private sector. What we're seeing from these results shows that industrial policies, particularly at the subnational level, need to be properly rethought. There has to be a rethink about it. And there are many reasons for this. First is that states do not have that much fiscal bandwidth to give much incentives to businesses. And we've had this traditional approach of states giving cheap lands, giving all kinds of subsidies and incentives, sometimes not properly coordinated, sometimes not really targeting, people that would use some of these resources well. So there's been a lot of uncoordinated approach in terms of subnational industrial policies. And sometimes what you also get is a situation where states are just, imitating one another, and sometimes, trying to create industrial policies that mirrors the federal government. How the federal government will approach industrial policies to attract firms or to grow firms within their territory will be completely different from a subnational that has a very limited fiscal bandwidth. Also, I think why it's also important to rethink subnational industrial policies is there hasn't been much evidence of the pattern of interstate manufacturing location decisions. Say, for example, a firm moving from, say, Lagos, where has been their traditional base, to another state, maybe in the remote state, say, for example, Jigawa, right? We haven't seen patterns of states or firms just saying because maybe Jigawa has some industrial policies in quotes and packing up shop in Lagos and moving to Jigawa. We haven't seen those patterns, right? And so that should get us to really think about what are we doing as far as, subnational policies are concerned. One thing that I see is that most times states imitate policies. When a state, for example, sets up, maybe embarks on a reform, you find out that almost 20 states are joining. And this doesn't give that variation. And the positive effect of these policies is often neutralized because almost at the same time, almost all the states are doing it. So, and when these policies are neutralized, at, say, for example, a Jigawa who is doing the same policy that Ogun State is doing, it then makes it difficult for disadvantaged states to have that leap. There has to be proper, thinking in terms of how to approach industrial policies as subnational. I think that's the point I'm making. If we're going to improve, some of the citizens' welfare level, jobs, decent jobs, revenue. And I also think that states would need to, attracting FDIs particularly, we've seen many states jump on ship to go to China, to go to UK, as shopping for FDIs. In my opinion, that also needs to be properly rethought. And I think one interesting thing from this report is that it's really challenging us to rethink some of these things. Lowering taxes, for example, needs to be. And as I conclude, a few points that I'd say is that states need to prioritize their target firms as they think about their industrial policies and achieve industrial competitiveness. Number one, there should be more focus on domestic businesses, like the current businesses within your jurisdiction. How are they faring? How are they doing? And I think those are very important questions that states would need to ask. Creating a supportive environment for new and innovative businesses. This idea of, going after foreign investment as a state, I think is misplaced. It's a case of misplaced priority. Like businesses within your jurisdiction, how do you care for them? States would also need to think more in terms of what areas can they control? What areas can they control? For example, you must know that if you go to attract FDI, it's more what would influence a firm to bring from for FDI to come into your state is beyond your microeconomic conditions. It's more macro, right? Can you control that? So because you can't control the macro issues largely, what you can do is focus on your domestic firms, grow them up to the point that they're then able to contribute to the global value chain, and then they can even be the ones helping you to attract, foreign direct investment. States will need to be more clear on the outcomes they hope to see, more jobs, because when there are jobs for states, then they can get PAYE from the jobs, and then it affects, their revenue bottom line. States would need to revisit subsidies programs that they're currently implementing. There are a lot of freebies that businesses get. Businesses that shouldn't get it are the ones getting it, right? So that's a waste of government resources. States will need to refocus. I see this. Lastly, let me just make this point as I close. States have Ministry of Commerce, Industry, and Trade. To be honest, I'm not sure about trade. That trade, mandate at the states, yeah, it makes sense, but I think commerce covers it. I think states should begin to think more in terms of entrepreneurship at their states, more in terms of developing startups, developing new ideas, new businesses that, already have that base within their state, and can provide the kind of outcomes, jobs, that they would like to see. And I also believe leadership is very important. Leadership often translates to the quality of institution and also stimulates investors' confidence in the state. We've seen this in the case of Kaduna, for example, when we had former Governor El-Rufai attracting a lot of investment just, by virtue of him being able to champion and be proactive. Yeah, so thank you so much. I think these are just some quick thoughts on the report. It's been very insightful listening to Dr. Olokere present those insights, and I hope that we all get a chance to read the reports, and then, of course, I hope it contributes to what we do in our daily lives. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, thank you, Mr. Dotun Shengo. I don't know. Do we still have questions? We've been told to drop our questions in the chat box. I've not seen any. So if we have any questions, we just have a few minutes to answer one or two questions, maybe directed to our presenter or the discussant. You can use the hand raising icon. I'm seeing a question. I don't know if this is a question, right? Chinyere Uduma, I think we'll just get all the questions at once, then to just answer them once. Chinyere Uduma says, an exceptional presentation, thank you. Can you elaborate on the weaknesses in APIA's transportation segment and explain why it ranks 32nd? I think Dr. Olokere will explain that, though he mentioned some indicators while he was touching, sub-indicators while he was touching the indicators. So probably we elaborate on that. Then, okay, Margaret, you're raising your hand and you can unmute. You have the floor now, please. Okay, Margaret, you have the floor, please. We can't hear you, so maybe you can drop your question in the chat box. We can't hear you. Then there's another question here from Rukayat Moses Ikem. What is the way forward for Nigeria? What parameters must be addressed to increase the country's performance in future scorecards? Professor Bright Area, I'll be directing that to you. Rukayat's question. So what's the way forward for Nigeria, and what parameters must be addressed to increase the country's performance in future scorecards? So Professor Bright will be answering that question. I think those are the two questions we have now. If Margaret can still drop just, then no problem. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you for that question. I think the question is, why would Abia score low on transportation and defense sector? I think we made a point here, and I think that point is general, that not necessary to single out a place, but to see what we can learn from one another, as well as to know the underlying indicator. So when the report is shared, we can see what are the underlying indicators. But let me just mention this. In the case of transportation, here transportation actually carries, because of, I mentioned as I was speaking, that because of the nature of data that is readily available. So when you see accessibility to Abia, I think Abia, if I can remember, probably doesn't have an airport, so that may be one of the factors that contributed to that result. So that doesn't necessarily mean that then Abia must go and set up an airport, but it's just to show that before you can travel there, you must come from other. That's not really a bad thing necessarily, but it also means that the state must also compensate, that aspect of the socio-economic development, so that also score relatively higher. Thank you.
Okay, so Professor Bright, before you come up, please. Someone asked the question before, which I've directed to you. Then I think there's another question for you that will just retake the first one. The first one is from Rukayat. It says that what parameters must be addressed to increase the country's performance in future scorecard. Then someone else is saying that, do you think it's better if government hands off poorly performing sectors and let private sector run them? What would be the implication for poor Nigeria? So Professor Bright, just take those two questions, then we'll round up from there.
Okay, all right, sorry. Thank you so much. So let me start with the last one. I think the key thing for us to notice that government has a serious role to play. I know so many people want the private sector to believe that the private sector is so critical when it comes to efficiency and when it comes to efficiency and ensuring that, yes, it has the answer to taking us out of some of the issues we are facing. But the truth also is that the government has a critical role to play. Even when we talk about the private sector itself, if you dig very well, you also find out that there are some kinds of things that are there here and there that will make you think that probably our private sector is not that prepared for us. So for me, I will advise some of these key critical sectors, especially sectors that should be, that will I say, social oriented, because government has a role to ensure that the social oriented sectors are driven by them, and such sectors have all it takes to drive the private sectors to be able to do what they should do. So my point is that, yes, that we can expect both the private sector and the government to be involved, but government also have a role to play in some critical sectors that are social oriented, and these are the sectors that will provide the needed environment for the private sectors to thrive, and therefore government still has a role to play. On what we need to do going forward to improve our future scorecard, the truth is that I have always said it in many fora to say, for Nigeria to come out of the quagmire where we find ourselves, we cannot do without driving what I call productivity. Productivity is very, very important. In fact, for long run growth and economic transformation, productivity is critical. And to do that, in the current state of where we are, we need to take a look at a number of things. Number one of them, and which is the binding constraint to productivity, for instance, is infrastructure. And by infrastructure, I'm talking in terms of what government can do. I know quite well that total government in terms of our share in total GDP probably is about 12 or less than 20%, right? It then implies that private sector is so significant when it comes to private sector investment is significant when it comes to driving infrastructure. So that points us to the need for government to drive some programs or framework that will allow a proper PPP arrangement to be able to finance infrastructure and attract some of the best capital we have in the world to be able to finance infrastructure for us. Equity to GDP ratio in Nigeria probably is about 20 something percent compared to South Africa that has about 300%. It tells you that their financial sector is so developed and is driven more by private equity in financing infrastructure also. So I think this is one area we need to take critical look at instead of government seriously thinking that they will be the one to provide almost all the infrastructure that we need. That is one. The other thing is that we can't do without ensuring law and order that will drive security in our system. Right. If we talk about welfare, talk about all of the issues that we have, law and order, security is some of the key things that have led us to where we are. And so we need to ensure that we need a proper leadership that will streamline and agenda this aspect of our country. Right. And that is so important. Other things to look out for is education and human capital. I mean, education and health, which are critical factors that determine human capital development. And human capital is one of the drivers of productivity. And beyond human capital that drives productivity is we are in a digital age. We are also talking about the fourth industrial revolution. And I think government needs to take a look at, especially with the fact that we have a youthful population, take a look at how we can now drive our education vis-a-vis to bring a skill that is industrially relevant across our subnational government that will drive productivity vis-a-vis to the piece that we need, and then drive welfare and job creation that will make us to have the needed competitiveness across states, and then reposition us for the future that we're talking about. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Prof. So we don't want to exceed our time schedule for this meeting, so we cannot go back to our daily activities. So most of the questions that have been dropped we'll be uploading these presentations and also the video on our website, so you can actually go there and download them. For some that are asking question in particular to some states, it also, since it's by state, you can actually view all information also across indicators. So we'll be running off from here. Thank you so much. We want to appreciate you for joining.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Change. Them good will not bring us before this one. Every new one now, we know the left. Okay. Let me go and remove myself.
Yeah.